first one. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really, really great. My question might not be a very good one, and might out me as one of the untalented, as Sextus has said. But how do I get to tranquility? I get the steps about like the skepticism and the looking at different positions and equal strength and stuff. But how would that make me less distressed? Like if I were to like go and ask a bunch of ethicists like what's the good life, and they all like come up with
well, you know, the thought of ancient philosophy was you need to know what is the you're only here for a short time, which we'll be talking about. All being is being toward death. I've taught Heidegger, and you know, I'm a lot closer to it than you are. If you don't, actually, there's one joke in being and time. I mean, Heidegger is not funny on the whole, but he says when you're young, death is something. When we are young, death is something we read about in the newspapers, but for the moment, one is not involved. That's not actually quite true, people. You're all involved. First of all, it can happen any time, whether you think it or not. So that was part of philosophy. Philosophy was directed towards determining the best life for man, as they would have put it. And that meant knowing what the world is like, what our human nature is like, and what is truly valuable, how we could best fit ourselves in, how beings as we are can prosper the most in a world as it is. That's what we need to know. And that's the task of philosophy as a way of life. And Sextus had this idea, now believe it or not, these dogmas, they're kind of fun to think about, but if you take them too seriously, they make it worse. Or Hegel thought, if you really took them seriously, make it incapable of living a human life at all. That's what he meant when he said skepticism was the truth of Stoicism. The Stoics seem to have believed you shouldn't really worry about things you can't control. They're indifferent. But it turns out the only things you can really control, at least according to Epictetus, are your own thoughts. So if you think that's a good life, Hegel said, be my guest, but it doesn't look much to me.
Thanks very much for that. I'll start, I suppose, at where you're finishing and where you're going to continue on tomorrow with Descartes and his invention of the mind. I suppose it's been said before, but it really struck me when you talk about Descartes being the first philosopher to make his own body part of the external world. Of course, Descartes isn't always as crude a Cartesian as that. In Meditation 3, he says, I am a thinking thing and not an extended thing. But by Meditation 6, you have him talking, and this is in the context, I suppose, of sensation perception. He's talking about the union of the mind and the body and the intermingling of the mind and the body, which puts him less in that crude Cartesian framework than that overview of him making the body just part of the external world puts it. And I think in modern philosophy as well, or some of the parts I'm looking at, I'm particularly interested in panpsychism. I think there's a crude Cartesian of the Meditation 3 type creeping in. Philip Goff in his argument for revelation talks about our direct access to the nature of consciousness. So he says, if pain was C fibers firing, we would know it, and since we don't, it's not. So we have this revelation. So I suppose I have two questions for you. One is, how crude a Cartesian do you think René Descartes was? How much of emphasis should we put on those insights he has in Meditation 6? And secondly, how much of the crude Cartesianism that you might find in Meditation 3 do you see as polluting modern philosophy?
Well, I don't know if I'd call it crude. First of all, Descartes' skepticism, the first meditation, is of course, in a way, entirely negative. It's designed to talk you out of a crude but largely undefined empiricism that he believes was his pre-philosophical training. He says, I believed everything I know came to me by or through the senses. He never explains what that means anywhere. But then he does seem to put knowledge of the material world, at least, all of the material world, in suspense. And you're right, he rebuilds towards getting back some knowledge of it, or at least justified beliefs about it. But he does so without presupposing it. I mean, the whole point about the cogito, I think, it's something he knows that he can't fail to know, as it were. And that gives him the idea that, well, at least I know I'm a thinking thing. I don't just know that I exist. I know what kind of thing I am. But then that gives him a clue to a new epistemic standard, namely clear and distinct perception, something which is both undeniable, it's clear, but it's also distinct. You won't confuse it with anything else. So you won't confuse your being as a thinking thing with your extended being. But then he gets them back, of course, if he gets them back, via a weird theological argument. And Jim and I were talking about this. Hume has the best comment on this one. He says, in the Inquiry, he says, to have recourse to the deity to assure us of the veracity of the senses is surely to make a most unexpected circuit. That's what Hume says. That's the end of the argument. That's like, you know, if you think that, if that's your argument for why I should just, you know, I'm seeing and talking to you here now, I need first to prove the existence of God. We've already gone pretty far off the rails. That's Hume's view. I mean, so, Hume, I love Hume in a way. I mean, he's actually very funny. You know, few philosophers are funny, actually, but Hume is funny. Hume is very funny. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Just a quick clarificatory question about what you said about the regress. When you said, could you just tell me again in what way the regress comes twice? That's one thing. And the other was, and thanks for this fantastic explanation of Pyrrhonian skepticism, which I agree with in most respects. But I also wanted just to ask about your views on Pyrrho's interpretation. So I know that Richard Bett has a very metaphysical interpretation of the Aristotle's passage, yeah. But there are other more skeptic, friendly ways of interpreting that, which will give a little bit more Pyrrhonian, as in Sextus, sort of outcome, which will be about living a life without any belief or any dogma or things like that. So, whether you had any view on reading the text like in that way?
I'm not sure. I'm quite getting it. I mean, I really do take seriously that philosophy. I mean, Bernier talks about taking philosophy into everyday life. It was always meant to be there. That was the idea. You needed to know the things that philosophers claim to know what the best life is. And Sextus just flat doesn't think that. He thinks it's kind of fun to think about these things, but you're better off without them. You don't want dogmatic convictions. That's what you don't want. They'll make things worse. I mean, even ordinary people think things are good or bad by nature. This is truly terrible. You know, Sextus would think, stuff happens. Deal with it, right? I mean, if you can. Don't go worrying about it all the time. So he really is deeply opposed to the necessity for what was thought to be philosophy in his time. Rorty, of course, was deeply opposed to what he thought was philosophy in his time too, although he managed to make a nice living as a philosopher at the same, despite that. So,
Mark, you read there? Yeah. I think you had your hand up.
Me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. Thanks for the lecture. I think I'm very sympathetic to the idea that yes, Pyrrhonian skepticism is a kind of skepticism that tries to avoid making claims, right? Wants to avoid.
yeah, but even in epistemology, that's what people, I think, mostly don't agree with me about. Like, Bernier thinks the modes are partly the basis of skepticism by showing that things are undecidable. I don't think that's true.
So I think I sympathize with that. But then I have a question which kind of also has a historical precedent, which is, does Pyrrhonian skepticism actually make a claim on us as knowers? This is a question that is pushed by some prominent anti-skeptics. Spinoza, for example, says that, well, if you encounter one of these global skeptics, right, and they start talking, they come with their modes and everything, but if you then ask them, well, do you know what you are saying? Do you know what you are asking questions about? Like, what's the point of this if you keep asking questions like that? Then it turns out the skeptic doesn't want to commit to anything, right?
Well, but notice, it's important to notice the chain of events. Someone who becomes a skeptic starts out in a disturbed state. Spinoza is a good example of someone who, in a way, shares this idea of ancient philosophy. I mean, if you can look reality in the face, Spinoza thinks, you will be from hope and fear set free, in his famous phrase. So notice Sextus says, nobody starts out to be a skeptic. You get to be one because of the experience you have when you turn to philosophy of the endless dispute. And the dispute isn't crazy. It's because they all have something to say on their side. But nobody has a decisive advantage over anybody else. But then he claims, and again without explanation, and it's not that he's concealing anything, as if fortuitously, he says, I don't know, some people find it's kind of fun to think about this, but my life isn't at stake with respect to who's right and who's wrong. There's all these interesting theories, they argue this, they argue that, we can think about them, you know. But you know, I don't have to I can enjoy doing that without thinking that my life is at risk if I don't sign up for one of these views. I mean, the skeptic, we discuss interesting questions, you know. If you were in some real life or death decision, would you think the person to ask situation, would your first idea to be to ask a philosopher was, you know, an academic philosopher, what you should do? I think we both tend to think the answer is minimally, not necessarily. I mean, some people have a kind of practical understanding of life which can't easily be put into words. But you know that some people are good to consult in matters of everyday life of consequence, and maybe some overly theoretical people, you know, I don't. You've got a difficult situation and somebody lectures you on Bayesian epistemology or something. It might not be the most appropriate thing.
No, sure, but just very quickly. Mm-hmm. So, it works that way for the skeptic, right? The skeptic has these experiences, and fortuitously, purely causally, it appears, they arrive at ataraxia and suspension of judgment and whatever. But I'm asking, you know, if you are Spinoza and you are convinced that you have knowledge of God, you know, like Descartes, etc. Similar arguments are found in Lucretius and other people. So, if you are still committed to finding knowledge, and this Sextus shows up, and he is only making claims at you, as it were, but they're not really reasonable claims, right? He doesn't want to back them up with reasons because he doesn't believe there are reasons fundamentally.
No, but you might say, look, where does Spinoza get all this knowledge from? I mean, first of all, these supposed deductions aren't as utterly irrefragable as things. Secondly, the premises aren't evidently undeniable. I mean, plenty of other philosophers have managed to deny them. So, I mean, he might be satisfied with his philosophy, but as a matter of fact, plenty of people aren't. I mean, we're not all Spinozists. I mean, what does it mean anyway, to speak of Deus sive natura, right? I mean, that at least, on the face of it even, is not too obvious. Maybe it means that even the material world is eternal or something, whatever. But who says that's true? Maybe there was a Big Bang. What was before the Big Bang? Maybe not. Who knows, right? I mean, the skeptic isn't trying to argue philosophers out of philosophy. What he says is that some people who are initially attracted to philosophy have a different, as they understood it in the ancient world, have a different experience. Namely, they find it far from a place where you can get convincing, life-changing truths. They find it as a theatre of constant dispute, divided into schools, but with positions developed by very clever thinkers, but often to radically different ends. Berryman said at the beginning, he's not going to explain, he's not going to justify, and he's not going to recommend, in spite of what he's just trying to say. He never recommends skepticism. He says later in one of the, I forget which one now, skeptics are helpful people. People who find their way on the path to skepticism might like to look at some of my works. They'll get some extra considerations there. So that's the closest he comes to recommending skepticism, I think, anywhere in the writings that we have. He's not trying to persuade you.
We have Sophie and then Richard.
Well, answering what you said, that skepticism seems to be more of a reaction to philosophy rather than either a philosophy or something that makes claims about our customs or our practices. We kind of defer to our customs and our practices. It's really a purely theoretical matter.
I mean, I think you do worry that sometimes there might be a kind of blinkered conservatism here, that nothing could be made any better. But, I mean, the fact is, I think it's the case that even when we are critical of modern practices, it's typically not for the first time and made up wholly by us. In other words, the influence of history and we don't escape it. Even our modern criticisms of contemporary events and institutions have their roots in prior thinking. They don't come from absolutely nowhere. But I do think there is a worry about Pyrrhonian skepticism that way. It looks as if it might just reconcile you to anything. That said, the ancient world is not the modern world. Nobody, for example, had the ability to blow up the entire planet. That would, that's a big change. Although the Greeks, life as a Greek male anyway, if you were a citizen, was not that easy. I think you were eligible for military service from like 18 to sometime in your 50s, and you went to war on average every 3 years. I've often thought that I've never been to war myself. I could never go because I'm blind in my right eye pretty much. But I've often thought that, close combat with edge weapons might have been just about the worst form of it, right? But that is a worry about Pyrrhonian skepticism. It can seem, if it's a philosophy, it can seem a bit of a stick in the mud philosophy. What he often says, though, is, but of course, I think there's a bit of de haut en bas about it too. When he speaks about other customs, you have a feeling there's an educated Greek looking down on the customs of other nations. So.
But it seems to me, I'm sorry, I never.
No, keep going.
The question. It seems to me that if you distinguish the three types of skepticism we're talking about, for like a theoretical skepticism, critical skepticism, which you mentioned very briefly right at the beginning, debunking a bad idea for very particular reasons, like Christianity or conservatism,
right?
Theoretically. And then there's the third kind, which is skepticism as an ethos that emerges in response to a very specific, confused Greek way of life, where you're trying to find out what the good is, and you're very worried you don't know what the good is. And he's telling you, you'll never know, so it's okay, just live your life, more or less. But it seems to me that is a kind of critical skepticism. So it's using the methods of a theoretical skepticism, which are kind of generalizable to any argument so far, to enact the goals of a critical skepticism. Like, skepticism as a way of life makes a claim, quite dogmatic claim, that people are at their happiest, accepting not knowing.
Well, you might think that, but he never says that. He never says that. He really never recommends it. I mean, that's just a fact. He says we're helpful. It may suit some people. If it does, I've got some books you might want to read. But he absolutely is not trying to talk anybody into it. Maybe it's too detached. It's a very cool, above the battle kind of view. And I think it can be dangerous. And I'm going to talk about that. Something I didn't say. I think that Richard Rorty, much as my teacher and lifelong friend, I think some of the things he said about don't work that well. And I think there's even something you might call a tincture of Pyrrhonism in Rorty. He put the Pyrrhonists down, but he had Pyrrhonian tendencies, I think. And I want to talk. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. But Sextus just is remarkably uninterested in recommending his philosophy. Here it is, But I mean, he even says, though, typically a skeptic doesn't turn out to be a skeptic. The skeptic wants peace of mind. The skeptic's disturbed. The skeptic's a thoughtful person. He's not just maybe happy with his local customs. There's no thought about that. But he wants some way of knowing whether he should be or shouldn't be. In some very general way, though. Not specific criticisms of, maybe we should be, maybe it's better to be Athens than Sparta or something, you might think that. Not that the Greeks, not that the Athenians were particularly kindly people. A lot of people have been pointing out recently that, Trump's guy, Stephen Miller, is probably unconsciously quoting the Milesian dialogue when Athens attacks the island of Melos, and they ask for mercy, and the Greeks tell them, the weak suffer, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. That's Thucydides, right? So, I mean, let's not get sentimental about not merely ancient Greece, but ancient Athens. I mean, it had its points, but no, the would-be skeptic is someone who is puzzled and seeks, what might be called the consolations of philosophy, and doesn't find them, or finds them in this weirdly indirect way that you could do without them.
So I want to mention, we have one more question, but up on the 5th floor of the D block, so you go to the AD lift, which is the orange or yellow line, I don't know which one. But up on D, 5th floor, there's wine and there's going to be nice food, hummus and all kinds of things. So that's all coming after Richard's question.
Oh yeah. Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. I was going to ask questions that are more or less in line with things people have been sounding at already, which is, do you really think that Sextus should have written about any of this? In the sense that what you're saying is that he's an anti-theoretical philosopher, and yet here he is reflecting, systematizing, noticing, in the sense that the craving for generality is in Sextus, and the sort of Wittgenstein themes that you mentioned, and that I presume will come up again tomorrow.
Well,
it's easier said than done.
I think you're right. I mean, he might very well think that the tendency to philosophize is just there.
Yeah.
That's why I think I partly think that this. I'm the only person, as far as I know, who thinks that the modes are not straightforward skeptical arguments. They are skeptical arguments, but they're intended for, as it were, skeptical in the Pyrrhonian sense, use. That are standing challenge to the idea of epistemology. And this, if I could get more textual about this if I wanted to. I think he thinks that the thought that there's no criterion, as it were, is very hard to live with. And but you could take an interest in that. You could maybe even hope that one day, you might have thought maybe one day there's something that's going to be suggested, that even I can't deal with. But I've no reason to expect it. And I don't think my life depends on that happening. So that's how you get the ataraxia that you thought you could take an interest in these very curious researchers, as I call them. But the trick of the Pyrrhonian is your life is not at stake. Your life may very well be at stake in the case of certain more focused objects of critical reflection. Nothing in Sextus says that couldn't happen. Nothing in Sextus says, hey, maybe we should try being a bit more peaceful, for once. We really have to attack another Greek city every 3 years or get attacked by them. This is, I think ancient life was pretty hard in ways we don't fully appreciate, maybe. But I also think you've got to be careful what you do or don't learn from Sextus, and that's what I think I want to talk about more tomorrow. I do think there are senses of objectivity, for example, that even though I'm not, in a way, a fan of much philosophical epistemology, I don't think it should lead us to turn our back on notions like objectivity. And I do think Rorty had some tendency to do that. And I want to discuss a philosopher who didn't recommend that from the 17th century. Yeah.